Well, definitely over the past 6 to 7 years, armed violence, which has been, which has prevailed in Mexico for decades. Over the past, as I mentioned, over the past 6, 7 years, it has reached levels that at some point are similar to those in certain armed conflicts, even though, properly speaking, the situation is not that of an armed conflict. But if we see the number of casualties at this point, depending on the sources, we could be speaking about of 80,000 casualties directly related to the situation of violence, which is related to drug cartels. Also, in terms of its extension throughout the national territory, it is going beyond the traditional hotspots. So we have basically the whole of the north of Mexico along the U.S. border directly affected by high levels of armed violence. We also see the use of weapons that are more commonly used in armed conflicts, particularly certain light weapons, explosive weapons, and they are affecting civilians directly and indirectly. We see proliferation of different armed actors, which are going beyond the big drug cartels. Now we have smaller drug cartels and their armed components. Another characteristic of the situation of armed violence in Mexico is displacement. We see how communities or sectors in different communities have decided to move out of these zones. And there have been some specific cases in northeast Mexico where entire communities have really been forced out of their territory because the lives of its members were at serious risk. So what's the extent of the conflict? In order to know that, one of the indicators that we have to study is that of victims, the one related to victims. So when we talk about these 80,000 casualties, who are we talking about? Those are we talking about individuals directly related to the drug cartels, or are we talking about civilians, common people who have been affected by the confrontation between the cartels or between the cartels and the armed forces? We have to improve the way we measure this. We analyze this indicator. There have to be improvements because over the past years, when we saw numbers skyrocketing, at some point there was no clarity of who were the components, who were the victims. Fortunately, over the past months, with the new presidential administration, there has been an acknowledgement of the limitations of the statistics we have and the need to improve them in order to develop more specific strategies. The situation is far from it's not near a tipping point in order for us to say that we are leaving the high levels of armed violence behind, but at least there have been certain approaches which are really important. Regarding victims, it is worth saying that in the case of Mexico, civil society has played a very important role, thanks to the formation of a big movement, a big civil society movement, which includes the participation of victims and their families. Thanks to that, we have had two major breakthroughs in the protection and promotion of the rights of victims. First, we have a special office to work on the rights of victims, and at a federal government level. And secondly, we have a law on the rights of victims. They are far from reaching the best possible levels, but at least it's a very good start. Now let's see what happens in the coming years. It's going to be really important that there is a synergy in the work between civil society and government. In general, civil society organizations, but more specifically from the academia, have been carrying out work to measure the different levels of armed violence in Mexico. Maybe under another concept, not necessarily as armed violence, but there have been interesting measurements, including perception of violence. Because at some point, and that's a very interesting case in point, before these high levels of violence in Mexico, say 6 years ago, if we analyzed the statistics at a national level, the levels of homicides, for instance, were going down. But at the same time, the perception of violence was going up. So there was no correspondence between these two facets. So there is, in that case, the media played an important role. So it's very easy to see how the information that is relevant for people is not necessarily getting there. There are demands from people in general to the federal government to do something about the present situation of armed violence. But people are, in principle, making reference to the high levels of violence related to the so-called war on drugs. Yet, what the federal government could do, and that's in the realm of the action of the federal government. But people, the actual levels of violence which affect people throughout the country have to do with common crimes at a local level that are not necessarily related to drug trafficking. And at that level, the federal government, it's not for the federal government to act, but rather it's for local and state authorities. So here we see how, well, the importance of information, but then whether or not this information is reaching people. And I think that that's an area in which authorities have to do something about to really generate the best possible picture about what's happening in Mexico. Of course, we also have another problem directly related to armed violence, which has to do with access to weapons. That has availability of weapons, in particular small arms, firearms in Mexico, has mushroomed also over the past 5 years. In principle, most of these weapons come from the US or are made in the US. But does that necessarily mean that they come directly through the US border? That's something that we don't really know. And there is a version that talks a lot about small illicit trafficking coming through this porous border. But I can say that there are no, we're lacking evidence or to say that that's what's really happening. At least it doesn't match the reality of the levels of firearm availability in Mexico, and in some cases, when we see the arsenals of drug cartels, we see that basically they have modern assault rifles and other light weapons, which could hardly be the result of this small scale, small arms trafficking through the border. So we have lots of questions out there that need to be answered. Then again, also in this, in regards to this issue, important steps have been taken, but more studies are needed, and ideally, as part of that synergy I mentioned between civil society and national authorities. Otherwise, it's very easy to develop myths around all these aspects of armed violence, and that's a big problem, because it's going to be, if we follow that path, it's going to be really hard to address those issues and make a difference, which is really needed in Mexico. As I said, the highest levels of armed violence are basically located in certain sectors of the country. But that doesn't mean that that will be the case in the years to come. Hopefully not, but the potential is out there. In particular, if we see how armed violence has spread throughout the country. So necessary steps have to be taken, but based on sound strategies that take into account what is really happening out there based on relevant statistics and studies.